Hello, I'm Dr. Brian Waldron. I'm a Senior Clinical Psychologist with ABI Ireland, and I'm going to talk through a series of slides on rehabilitation for attention problems, memory problems, and problem-solving strategies for people who've had brain injuries. So initially we're going to just look at brain injury and then there's different subtypes of brain injury that we would work with. A little piece on anatomy of the human brain, and then the cognitive areas we're going to cover will be attention and concentration, learning and memory, problem solving, and decision making as well. So in terms of ABI, it's a cover term, an umbrella term for one-off, acute, non-chronic onset damage to the brain. So they would be things like car crashes, falls, assaults, that type of thing. So we're not covering multiple sclerosis or some of the chronic onset ones. In terms of the client groups we work with, probably about 45% of people would have traumatic brain injuries, which they classify as mild, moderate or severe, and those are your falls and assaults and car crashes. And then we work with probably another 40% of people who've had strokes. So also called cerebral vascular accidents, and there's three types. So there's ischemic stroke where there's been a clot or a blockage in an artery of the brain, and the area of brain downstream from that blockage can get damaged by lack of oxygen. The second type of stroke is a bleed. And a bleed deep inside the brain is called an intracerebral hemorrhage. And then a bleed that's at the surface of your brain, under the bony part of your skull, is subarachnoid hemorrhage. There's a number of layers of tissue between the surface of your brain and the bony part of your skull called the meninges. One of them is the arachnoid layer as well. So the other percentage of people we work with, so there's some people who've had encephalitis and meningitis, and those are both infections. Encephalitis is infection of the surface of your brain. Meningitis is infection of those layers between the surface of your brain and the bony part of your skull. More recently as well, a lot of people who have had anoxic brain damage, so that's where you've, for example, had a heart attack and there's a lack of blood flow, a lack of oxygen into your brain, and you can get brain damage from that as well. And then I suppose people who have had tumours as well is another subgroup that we'd work with. But regardless of the way that you've got your brain injury, all of those different causes can affect your frontal lobes, and that's going to cause executive problems. So that's planning, problem solving, attention concentration, starting and stopping behaviours, being able to self-monitor and self-correct. Similarly, any of those different causes of brain injury could affect your temporal lobes, and they're going to cause memory problems. So I suppose the rest of the slides will look at the types of strategies around that. So in terms of your brain, there's two hemispheres, two halves. There's a left half and a right half. And for people who are right-handed, it's the left half of your brain that does all the language functions, and it's the right half of your brain that does all the kind of visual reasoning type functions. On each side, you've got a frontal lobe, so two temporal lobes, two parietal lobes, and two occipital lobes. As I was saying, frontal lobes do all that complex attention, concentration, planning, problem solving. Temporal lobes do memory. And if you're right-handed, your left temporal lobe is doing both speech production and speech understanding. Now, two different areas in that lobe, but it'll be left side. Parietal lobe is doing your understanding of how your body is operating in space, so where your arms and legs are. Also the body sensations that come back from your arms and legs are processed in the parietal lobe. So it's almost like there's a little model of your body that's in there, that's working away. And then the occipital lobes, which are right at the back of your head, are very specialized for visual processing. So your optic nerves essentially send information to that part of your brain at the back, and it's that piece that allows you to see. So if you've got damage at the back of your brain, you will have visual problems even though there's nothing wrong with your eyes. In terms of if you want to go and look up some more stuff, there's some good apps you can find, including 3D Brain, which is for free on the different app stores, and you can look at the different areas there. So in terms of the areas of cognitive function we're going to look at attention and concentration, those types of attention and concentration, brain areas and strategies. We're going to look at learning and memory, the different types of learning and memory, the brain areas involved, and the strategies that work for those. And then problem solving, we're going to look at, again, some models of problem solving, brain areas involved in that process, and then the strategies that work well for that. Okay, so the three big areas that we're going to talk about in terms of rehab. are attention, concentration, learning and memory, and problem solving. So we're going to look at, within each of these areas, there's different, I suppose, subtypes. So when we talk about attention and concentration, there's actually a few things going on. When we talk about memory as well, there's a few things going on. So for each of these, we'll look at types of attention, brain area strategies, we look at types of memory, brain area strategies, problem solving, different models of problem solving, the brain areas involved in those, and then the strategies that work well as also. So the first of those three then is attention and concentration. So when we talk about that area, really we're talking about a number of different things, and we'd look at sustained attention, selective attention, divided attention. So sustained attention is your ability to focus on something over a long period of time. Selective attention is your ability to focus on something and then select out distractions that are happening. And divided attention is your ability to focus on two things at once. But really what that involves is a degree of flexibility, because you're switching between the two things you're focusing on. So a good example would be driving. You're on a long driving trip. It's the sustained attention that allows you to drive for a long time. It's the selective attention that allows you to filter out the radio when there's a complex bit of road. And then the divided attention is, we'll say, after the complex bit of road is done, you're back in the motorway, now I'm listening to the radio and driving as well. So that would be the two of those. Now, what we know from a rehab standpoint, this is very important, is those attention systems in your brain are heavily dependent on how alert you are. Now, alertness in the brain comes from some brainstem areas, but what they've shown through research is that, and it stands to reason, is the more alert you are, actually the more switched on those other three systems are, and there's interactions between them. So by working with clients and trying to get people when they're very alert to do the rehab, that's the best way forward. And this means knowing your family member or knowing your clients. So for some people who'd be great in the morning, that's where you're trying to target the rehab, and then there's other people who aren't great until the afternoon, and that's the better time to do the work with them. So in terms of the brain areas for attention, the main one, which is on the next slide, is orbitofrontal circuit. So it's a part of your frontal lobe that's in behind your eyes, and it's called orbitofrontal because it's frontal lobe and then behind the orbits of your eyes. So it's that part of your brain back in there. It's involved in attention and concentration, but also things like social restraint and empathy and inhibition of interference. So we know that, for example, with people who have autism, where they find it very difficult to take the perspective of somebody else, to see what it's like from somebody else's point of view, or similarly in brain injury, where people have a great problem identifying emotions in other people or really feeling what other people are feeling, it can be damage to those areas. But again, yeah, they're heavily involved in attention as well. So strategies, what actually works? So there's been lots of research on this area, really probably since the 60s and 70s. So the simple strategies tend to work well. And I suppose before going on to the specifics in the slides, just bear in mind that more or less practice for attention and concentration tasks works very well. The more you do these tasks, the better you'll get at them. But for memory stuff, it doesn't work as well. And in about 10 slides time, I'll kind of go through why that is. But for the moment, your first strategy for attention and concentration really is just reducing distraction. So you can look at internal distractions for the person and then external distractions in the environment. So internal distractions, people get tired, they daydream, people get anxious. So maybe working at a fair speed, trying not to stay on one point too long, is a way of keeping the work going, and it doesn't get externally or internally distracting for people. And then setting specific goals to work on, and we would use what they're called SMART goals. So they're specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and in some sort of a time frame, so that the person with the brain injury is working on a very clear goal. And then in terms of well-being and reinforcement, we reward for reaching that goal, whether that's just going out for a coffee or even just taking note of it's something you've achieved. So those work well. Very importantly then are external distractions. So for people with brain injuries, they find it very hard to filter out stuff that's going on around them, and they get overloaded very easy. So looking at noise in your environment, doing the work in an environment that doesn't have the radio or the TV or too much going on. Visual distraction as well can be important. So even though it might be quiet, but there's a lot of people moving back and forth, that can be distracting. So again, it's about knowing the people you're working with and trying to get the work done in an environment that's the least distracting possible. And then in terms of interruptions, you suggest turning off your mobile phone, but then there's also great strategies where you'd be deliberately using your phone as a distractor, and I'll come on to those in subsequent slides. So in terms of, it's to go back, I suppose, to the point about the more alert you are, the better your attention systems will operate. And Ian Robertson, who is a Scottish psychologist who worked in Trinity for a number of years, did an awful lot of work in attention rehab for people with brain injuries. And in the 90s, he took 8 people who had an unusual attention problem called left neglect, where people with this issue will tend to ignore things on the left side of space or the left side of their bodies. And you'll see this subtly, maybe people will bump into door frames on their left, but there can be extreme versions where people will only shave one side of their face or eat off one side of the plate. So Ian, anyway, looked at those people, and they were trained to sustain their attention by a self-alerting process. Initially, it was saying really loudly out loud to wake up, and it kind of shocks you into being awake. And as the training progressed, it got softer and softer and became just internal speech, just saying to yourself silently, wake up. But what he noticed was it was switching on the other attention systems the more alert people got, including the neglect one. So people were no longer experiencing the same amount of left neglect, and they were able to sustain their attention for longer purely by boosting their level of alertness. There was then a follow-up study a couple of years later where, again, people with left neglect, and this time there was a loud interrupting tone that would come on before they did a computerized task about identifying did a line appear on the left or the right of a screen. Now, people with left neglect will be slow if it comes up on the left side, but good if it comes up on the right. And what he noticed was, with the very loud tone, again, it was increasing people's alertness, and they were much better able to identify when the line was occurring on the left of the screen. So again, in the real world, what this means is the more alert you are when you're doing your rehab tasks, the better you'll be able to attend to them. So another real, I suppose, real world difficulty people have is using multitasking. So for people with brain injuries, there was a very interesting study done by Manley in 2002. So they had 10 people, and they asked them to do a set of 5 tasks. Now, to do all of the 5 tasks to their completion would take much longer than the allowed time, but the purpose of the test was, can you switch and do a little bit of each of the 5? So for people with brain injuries, what tended to happen was that they would start the first task and then they would forget to switch. Or they might switch once or twice, but they wouldn't get the 5 tasks done by the end of the allotted time. So what they discovered was, when you had this interrupting tone every few minutes, it prompted people, all right, I'm supposed to switch, and people were much better able to switch when they had that external cue coming in. And interestingly, they had age and IQ match control groups, so people who were just as able, around the same age, and when you had the interrupting tones in, now the people with brain injuries were no different from that control group. So in terms of memory, understanding the learning and memory and the strategies we use for them, you have to go back to 1890 and William James. And he was the first psychologist in modern times to really talk about the idea, when we talk about memory, there's more than one thing going on. And he talked about a memory for stuff that's happening in the here and now, but also separately, there's obviously a memory for things that are long ago. And then, I suppose, looking at the mid-60s, Atkinson and Schifrin, who had looked at short-term memory and long-term memory, and their particular area was short-term memory. And they did a lot of research which showed how it's a very limited capacity memory with maybe 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information that you can take in any one go. And it's also something you have to kind of consciously rehearse in your head to keep that information in there, and not all of it will go into long-term memory. And it's susceptible to interference as well. So if you've new information coming in, it'll knock out what was there previously, because you can still only have 7 or 8 or 9 bits of information in that short-term store. So then fast forward to the 80s with Tulving and colleagues. So by the 80s, what's happened is you've now got brain scan technology, and you've got the ability to put people into scanners. They take a drink of a tiny bit of very short half-life radioactive glucose, and when they do different tasks in the scanner will show what parts of their brain which uses glucose are lit up, and you can identify the correspondence between the tasks in the different brain areas. And what they found was, what we thought of as long-term memory was 3 distinct things. There was semantic memory, episodic memory, and procedural memory. So with semantic memory, that's memory for facts. So you could consider language being factual memory, but it's also facts like, if you think of what street sign is red and octagonal, it's a stop sign, and there's facts that go with that and understanding. The second type of memory is procedural memory, and that's memory where there's a very strong motor component to it and physical action. So making up tea, riding a bike, driving would all be considered that kind of procedural memory. Or martial arts would be a good example as well, because it's heavily involved in body movement. And then the last type of memory is episodic memory, and that's the memory for the day-to-day events that happen, so our autobiographical memories, episodes essentially. So that's semantic, procedural and episodic. Lastly, Lynch and Yarnell are worth mentioning because they did interesting research in the 70s with college football players in the States, and they discovered how very susceptible the whole memory system is to even very subtle I suppose head injuries, but not even to the extent that you'd see in professional football, where if they got to the college players within a couple of minutes of there being a knock, generally people were well able to explain where they were in the game, what half it was, what the score was, because the information was still in short-term memory. But if they left it more than a few minutes and went out and asked the same questions again, information was gone because it hadn't been transferred to long-term memory. So that's the kind of types of memory. So in terms of brain areas, and we can go on to the next slide now, that'll be, on this slide, you're seeing an area highlighted, which is the amygdala. And it's actually this area here, and then the hippocampus, which is this purple piece here. Now you've got one of these on each side, and it's the hippocampus that's critical for forming new episodic memories. So how it works, and this was discovered completely by accident in the late 90s when they were trying to develop a marker that would detect cancer cells. It was great, it detected the cancer cells, but when they tested on people, they also found it was detecting cells that they didn't understand in that hippocampus. And more than that, those cells seem to be spreading out from the hippocampus to the surface of the brain and making new connections. And they inferred then that it's almost like a biological tape recorder that's spewing out this tape all the time, and you're recording your memories on these new cells that are being born in that area. So initially this is called neurogenesis, and it's been seen in monkey brains, in human brains, and that from the late 90s, but it's also got implications for things like PTSD. So there's an interesting study from the mid-90s where they looked at Vietnam veterans from 20 years before. They did brain scans, and they found that those two areas you saw, the hippocampus and the amygdalas, were shrunken down in the Vietnam vets who had PTSD versus the Vietnam vets who did not have PTSD. And what they were thinking was that this was the end point of 20 years of PTSD, where you're remembering all this stuff but trying not to remember. You can see this in people's brains by these areas being shrunken. The converse is true as well. So in London, taxi drivers have to do this test called the knowledge, where you have to have a mental map of London and be able to go anywhere you want in it. So they scanned the brains of these taxi drivers, and they found that the hippocampus that does the visual memory, which should be the right side, was much larger than normal. So their years of practice on doing different routes and really developing a very strong visual memory, at the end of their careers, you could see it in their brains. So this next slide just shows that marker cell in the brain of a monkey. So the yellow blob, they would say, is a new brain cell, and then the slide after that I think is much clearer. That's a neuron, a new neuron from neurogenesis in the brain of a human. So in terms of strategies for memory, there's a number of different strategies that we know over the years work well, and then there's some strategies that you think might work that don't. So just on the next slide, it starts off with internal memory strategies. So these are the sorts of strategies you would use, really, I suppose, if you're quite well functioning, how to capitalize on a good memory. And that's things like don't learn off what you don't understand. You try and get a grip on the information, relate information to what you know already so that it makes sense. You'd be breaking the information down into several parts. You'd also be reviewing information a number of times, because you'll get a learning curve where you'll remember more and more each time that you look at the information. You'd be trying to take a break after 30 or 40 minutes, and this is without a brain injury. This is all of us. Trying not to take in too much information at once as well. So while at one level it's good to know about these internal strategies, really what we found for people with brain injuries is they don't really do well with those strategies, and you've got to have a different set that will work well for people. So you're relying on what's called external memory strategies. I mentioned earlier that practice worked well for attention and concentration type stuff, but we're going to see now that it doesn't work as well for memory. And the reason is because a couple of slides ago you saw the hippocampus producing those new cells, and once that's damaged, there's no other area in your brain that can take over and start producing the cells. So there's nothing else that can write these new memories or create them, so you've got to find a way of adapting to that and compensating for it. So what we'd recommend for people is using any one of these sorts of strategies. So a written diary or journal, wall charts, planners. I've seen people use those little yellow sticky notes very effectively, but probably the best strategies would be ones that involve some sort of reminder system. So using your phone, using the calendar function on your phone and getting to grips with that, setting alarms, using Microsoft Outlook, using any other kind of electronic memory aid, and including things like dictaphones, whatever you can use to externalize that memory into a diary or a device or onto tape is the way to go. And ideally, what we'd say is the electronic ones are the ones that allow you to have the reminder piece come in, and that's going to work better than a diary because people will forget to use their diaries. So again, one worth mentioning, one of the ways that we train the rehab staff here is to be mindful of doing the kind of memory testing that we do with the clients. We run it with staff, and some of the lessons that come out of that is you can see very clearly the capacity of short-term memory. When we do a training group with 20 or 30 people, we find the same results that Lynch and Yarnell and Atkinson and Schifrin found in the 60s. We find even today people have 7 ±2 bits of information that they can take in one go, but they'll have a learning curve. So every time they try the test, it'll be 7 and then 9 and 10 and 11 and 12. If you overload people, what you'll get is what they call a primacy and recency effect. So people remember the first part of what they were trying to learn, and they'll remember the last part, but they'll have forgotten the middle piece because it's overloaded. And then the other bit that will come out strongly as well for this is our staff, so people without brain injuries, is that once you switch and you start trying to learn something else, you'll be both bad at learning the new thing and it will knock out what you've just spent the last 10 minutes trying to learn. So there's this interference effect. So so just to run that again, for working with people with brain injuries, be mindful that the capacity of their short-term memory is going to be less, so you're trying to focus on a couple of things at any one time. There will be a learning curve, they'll get better at it, and you need to do it repetitively. If you overload them, they'll only remember the beginning and the end. And lastly, you have to be careful to then take a break before you do something else, because if not, you'll get the interference effect. So that's important. The next set of slides then, we're going to talk about prospective memory. And this is remembering to do stuff in the future. And it's a kind of a complex enough process. There's, at a basic level, 2 parts to it. There's a retrospective piece nearly where you're trying to remember what it is that you have to do, but then there's the prospective piece, which is doing it when you're supposed to do it at some point in the future. Next slide. So talking about training and compensation, there was a lot of very good, well thought out, well done research on trying to train people's prospective memories to increase over time, which was published in a number of different studies. And they found that they could, with a lot of practice, get people's prospective memory up from maybe a couple of minutes up to sort of 3 minutes up to maybe 15 minutes to 20 minutes. But that's no good to you if you're trying to remember something for next Tuesday. And Barbara Wilson, who'd be one of the kind of leading clinical psychologists and rehabilitation specialists in the UK, commented that there was a huge lack of evidence that any sort of restorative training for memory worked, and really there's been a huge problem with that kind of an approach, and a shift in emphasis has now occurred. So Wilson and Powell comment that rather than ask the question, how can I improve the person's memory, because you're not going to be able to, the real issue is how can I suppose what's the best way for that person to retain information whatever way they can. And you're really trying to train people to use their intact abilities and capitalize on old learning. So in years gone by, people knew what calendars were and they knew what to-do lists were. For people growing up today, people will know their apps, so they'll always know what a calendar app is and how it works, and they'll know how to use that technology. So you're trying to capitalize on all of that stuff to help people in their day-to-day lives access and remember information, and prompts to do the things that they need to do. So this slide is just an example of how effective this can be and some limitations to it. So this is a study that I did a few years ago, and we had 5 participants, A, B, C, D and E, and they were learning to use an electronic memory aid. It was a very basic mobile phone type device. So what we discovered was that even with the reminders, people still sometimes weren't getting 100%. And what was happening was the reminder would go off on the device, the person would look at it, they'd read the wee note on the screen, and they'd say, okay, they'd dismiss it, and then they'd be distracted by something else that would happen, and it would be gone that they were supposed to do the task. So I suppose the strategy there for real world use of mobile phones for the people we work with is do not dismiss the wee reminder until you've actually done the task, because there's a good chance you'll forget to do it then over the intervening few minutes. Okay, so we're going to look now at problem solving, so much more, in some ways, a much more complex area. So if you were to open a psychology textbook, you're going to find models of problem solving, and they look something like that slide. So it's almost as if we were somehow computers and we're rationally going down through things. So things like putting the problem into your working memory, looking into your long-term memory, have I seen this problem before and do I know how to address it? You're making an attempt at solving the problem, and then you compare your situation with the goal state. Is the problem solved or not? And if it's solved, great, but if not, you're going back up the model to one of the earlier levels, which is all fine and well, but the real world problem solving that we do and the decision making we do isn't as logical or as formal as that diagram would show. So I suppose in terms of strategies or brain areas as well, you're again talking about frontal lobe type functions with these complex tasks. So in this case, dorsolateral frontal lobe, which would be the bit that's sort of there in under my skull. So it's planning and organising, problem solving, and also things like fluency, which in this context has a particular meaning. So if you think, how many words can you think of that begin with the letter F in 10 seconds? So how many boys' names can you think of in 10 seconds? Where you're having to come up with information out of nothing. Now it gets complex then when you're in the real world where you're trying to switch. So how many boys, think of a boy's name and then a car make, and then a boy's name and then a car make, and then a boy's name and then a car make. So you're having to generate lists and swap between them. So that's the area of your brain that does that sort of stuff. And even though they may seem like almost artificial tasks, they're quite like the real world problems that we come up with. So the strategies we use for the clients is, first of all, the world is overwhelming for people, particularly when you've had a brain injury. So the first order of business really is to simplify things down for people. And oftentimes people get stuck with problem solving issues because they can't really identify what the problem is because there's so much going on. So time management skills, basic time management stuff, prioritize tasks. So list the 10 things that you have to do this week and do 5 of them. And then list the 10 things that you might like to do this week and do 5 of them. But what you're doing is you're whittling down the chaos of the real world down to some manageable tasks that people can do. And that's probably a good first strategy for this. So then in terms of the second strategy, you're back to this idea of having goals that are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic and time framed, which makes it very clear to what you're working towards and what you're trying to do. Also, for when we work with people over extended periods of time, you'd be trying to break the goals down into short-term goals, medium-term goals and long-term goals. So, going back driving might be a long-term goal. A short-term goal would be to do the theory test first, and then you might go and see an occupational therapist to make sure your perception is okay, and then do the in-car driving test with IWA or the NRH, and then your long-term goal might well still be to go back driving, but it helps break it down. Then there's other strategies we give to clients as well. There's the 5WH system, so who, what, where, when, why and how. So simply have those on a page. Clients can try and fill in the bits and pieces that could help clarify thinking and move things on. And then really it's again about trying to take the problem step by step. So you're identifying what's the problem, what are the possible solutions, what's the best solution out of the ones you come up with, trying that approach and seeing is it effective, and then trying a different approach if needed. So this slide, where it's kind of broken into boxes, is the same information, but we've found that printing this page has been enormously helpful for some of our clients, because for people with brain injuries, what will happen is they'll identify sometimes that there's a problem. So an example might be, I need to get an apartment because I'm moving out of the long stay hospital. And we've had people who go on to Daft and they'll do a search and they'll put a deposit on the first apartment on the first page on the first time they searched it. And that can lead to all sorts of problems. But a way around it is if clients have a kind of a formal way of doing it, where in this example you've got solution 1, solution 2, solution 3, solution 4, and it was very helpful where once people realized, all right, I have to have 4 solutions, they were actually much better at, they could pick the right one and they could see the best one. But it was simply that we prompt to don't go with the first thing in your head and pick 4 different ones and then decide which is the best one. So you're looking at your best solution, trying it, did it work, and then if it didn't work, try one of the other ones that you've come up with. So that's been effective. So the other thing that's really worth talking about is all of the slides to date have been quite logical and quite cognitive in some ways, but really how we make decisions is often very emotion based. And the slide that you can see now is a very famous guy, Phineas Gage, who had a significant brain injury in 1848. He was a railway worker and his job was to go out in front of the crew, drill holes in the ground, drop dynamite in the ground. He had a big metal rod that he'd put sand in and tamp down the dynamite, and they'd do a string of these and blow up a section of mountain for the train to go through. And one day he went out and he got the sequence wrong. So he drilled the hole, put the dynamite in, forgot the sand, jammed the dynamite with the rod, and the rod was fired up through the top of his head. So he had a bilateral frontal lobe injury. So both of his frontal lobes were injured in that accident. Now, he wasn't killed, and they say he wasn't even knocked out, but his personality was completely altered from that point on. And not only his personality, but his ability to make good decisions was really hugely compromised. And this kind of has led to this idea of what they call the somatic marker. And it's the emotions and how they contribute to decision making in the brain. Because decision making usually occurs when we don't know how the outcome is going to work out, and there's risks involved, and chance as well. So what the somatic marker idea is, that there's, I suppose, the way we feel about particular possibilities will influence the decisions we make. So if you think of a very small problem that you have at the moment, and then if you imagine doing something that makes it 100 times worse, do you get a bad feeling from that? And I'm sure you do. And that's the somatic marker. So it's the idea that this body sensation will keep us away from making bad decisions. But in the case of Phineas Gage, and in people who have that type of frontal lobe injury, they don't get those bad feelings when they're considering potential decisions and outcomes, which is why people with brain injuries will often make poor decisions, and will often make the same poor decision repeatedly and seemingly not learn from it. So that's part of what's going on, is that bad feeling you get when you make a bad decision, or even when you consider a decision that could go bad. People with brain injuries aren't really getting that feedback from their bodies. So yeah, in a nutshell, the reasoning is guided by an emotional component as well, and that's very much how we make decisions. So there isn't a huge amount of rehab strategies around this type of area yet, but I suppose in working with the clients, often it can be helpful sometimes anyway to look at how do they feel about the decision they're making, and asking them to pay attention to, do you get a bad feeling or not when you're thinking about these different options. And essentially that's the last piece around problem solving. So thank you.